In today's video, we're going to take a look at the if function. It's a very handy function when we're looking to evaluate different conditions in our data and returning different columns, text, or numbers. It should help us with reporting, data analysis, and working with our data. And to get us started, we have a sample data set over here with department, our budget spent, and allocated budget. And what we want to answer with this if function is whether we came in under or over budget. So instead of going through this manually trying to line up if we were under or over, we could use the if function to easily identify that. And we can start by typing if, and our logical test in this case can be if our budget spent is less than our allocated budget. And we can hit comma. Then we get into if this is true, we want to return that we are under budget. And if that is a false condition, we will return over. And we'll close that. And let's drag our formula down. And here we can see that the if function allowed us to easily see where we came in under or over our budget, versus having to manually go row by row and make that determination. In our next example, we'll look at the if function with dates. In this case, we have different tasks with a planned completion date and when they were actually completed. And the question we're asking ourselves is, if the planned completion date is before the actual completion date, return on time. If that's false, return late. So let's go into our if function. And if our planned completion date is less than or equal to our actual completion date, we can say that that was on time. And if that is false, meaning our planned completion date was after the actual completion date, we can return late. And let's pull this down. And here, once again, we can see that this allows us to easily get a sense of when our planned dates were before actual completed dates for on time or when they were late. Now, as we're looking at the if function, there's two Excel functions you might run across, the if function and the ifs function. And we'll go through what the difference between those two functions are and take a look at it in this example. Now, if we're starting with the if function, one of the things we know that it only allows us to evaluate one criteria. So if we start by typing our if function, we can say that there's one logical test, then what happens if that's true, what happens if that's false, which can get into the question of what if we have more than one logical test that we need to evaluate. So to do that with an if function, we can do it through a series of nested if functions. And for this data set, we have some employee name, department, and their performance rating score. And based on that score, we want to return whether it's excellent, good, average, or needs improvement. So to start with our if function version, we can start with if. In our logical test, our first one will be if this score is greater than 90, we need greater than or equal to 90. If that is true, we want to return excellent. We can either type that in or reference the cell and lock it on each 7, F4. Now, if that is false, if we want to do this with the if function, this is where we start getting to the nested if function. So we can start by typing the if function again, and then doing another logical test on if this cell C7 is greater than or equal to 80. In that case, we want to return good, which will be this cell. Make sure to lock it. Then if that is false, so instead of jumping into that argument, we're once again going to go back into our if function, reference C7. If that is greater than or equal to 70, then we want to return average if that is true. Then And then our final criteria will be if C7 is less than 70. If that is true, we'll return needs improvement, block that. And value if false, we can put not found if this does return a false. And then we'll just need to close out our parentheses with all of the if functions, so we can add the extra parentheses until our formula closes out. And then hit enter. And here you can see that 85 falls within the good range, 92 excellent, 78 will be in our average, 65 will be needs improvement, and we can drag the rest of this down. So we can see that that is possible with if function, but it does get a little bit more complex as we start to nest those if functions. If someone was to come back to this formula, or we were reviewing it ourselves, it might be hard to understand what each if was doing and where it was referencing. So that brings us to the ifs function, which can make this a little bit more of a simple process. So we can start by typing ifs, and here we can see that we're shown a logical test and what to happen if true. In this case, we can do the same thing we did with our if function, where our logical test will be if C7 is greater than or equal to 90, and we want to return excellent, if that's the case. Then as we hit comma into our next optional set of arguments, it then gives us a logical test 2, which we can then go through the same logic that we had for the previous formula, where if C7 is greater than or equal to 80, have that reference. This out of the way, good. And then our third logical test, if this is greater than or equal to 70, have that return average. And if this C7 is less than 70, have that return needs improvement, and lock that. And then let's pull this down and make sure that we get all the same answers. And there we go. We can see that both of these functions accomplish the same task, but the ifs function was a little bit more streamlined and cleaner of a formula when we need multiple criteria that we need to keep evaluating. Now let's take a look at how we can start incorporating some additional functions with if. So say we want to look at using the if function, but we have multiple criteria that we want to make sure are met. And in this case, the question that we're trying to answer is if the sales target is greater than or equal to 100K, and the customer satisfaction target is greater than or equal to 90%, we want to return that our goal achieved was met, and if that is false, return no. So what that looks like with the if function is we can start by typing if, and then we'll jump into our and function where it's saying logical test. So let's type in and this will introduce our and criteria, which is the two criteria that we're looking to be met. And so the first one in this case is our sales target, which is in B7. We want to make sure that that is greater than or equal to 100K, which would be our logical 1. And for a logical 2, we want to make sure our customer satisfaction target in C7, we want to make sure that that is greater than or equal to 90%. And we want to make sure that we lock these as we drag our formula down. And then so it should be 7. So we'll hit F4 to make sure those are locked. And then let's close around that. Now we can get back into what do we want to return if true. So in this case, if our sales target and customer satisfaction target are both above 100K and 90%, we will return met. And if that is false, we can return no. And close our formula. And here we can see our first one. This is greater than or equal to 100,000 and greater than or equal to 90%, therefore met. And if we pull this down, we can see the conditions where it was met and not met. In our next example, we'll take another look at using the if and function. In this case, we have transaction data set with different orders, and we want to use the if and function to help us pull over if the order is paid and shipped. We want to mark that the order is completed, and if that is false, if either one of those is false, return that that order is still pending. So start by typing if and our first logical test is, does paid equal yes? And then our second logical will be, does this equal true? And we need to be careful with this one, since Excel will not identify true or false as text. So I'll show that if we type this J7 equal true, same way that we did for the yes, and we can close out our parentheses. Then if that both of those were true, we return completed. And if one of those was false, this would return pending. And here for this first example, we can see that this is paid and shipped. So why is this still returning pending? And this goes into how Excel will read true or false. So it will not identify this necessarily as text, as it will pick up for yes, or if we were to look at certain colors. So one thing, if you do notice this as an error in your formula, is if we remove the quotation marks around true, that Excel will now recognize that those are equal. And then we can go ahead and pull down the formula. And here we can see that when it is paid and shipped, that those are completed. And if one of those or both are false, then this order is still pending. So a little trick there. So in case you are using this formula for anything that is referencing a column that has true or false, that can be something to double check if you are noticing an addition. Now let's take a look at, instead of using the AND function, where we need multiple criteria to be met, let's look at the OR function, where we're looking for just one criteria from multiple to be met. In this case, we can use the if/or function to understand from this data set with employee name, sales, and customer satisfaction rating. We want to know that if the sales are greater than 100K or the customer satisfaction target is greater than 90%, let's return bonus. And if false, let's return blank. This will work very similar to the AND function. So we'll start by typing if instead of and, we're looking for an OR criteria. So let's type in OR. And once again, we're presented with our logical operators. So our first logic is going to be if our sales are greater than 100K. So our sales, is that greater than our sales target? Make sure we lock that. Or for our second logical test, we want to know if our customer satisfaction rating, if that is greater than 90%. Once again, lock that. And then we'll get into what happens if this is true or false. So if either one of those is true, then let's return bonus. And if both of those are false, then let's return a blank, which we can just do with a double quotation mark. So it's our formula. And then let's drag this down. And here we can see the cases where one or both of those criteria were met. So in this case, sales target wasn't met, but customer satisfaction target was met. Or in cases where both of those were met, the bonus was achieved. Now let's take a look at another example where we have customer information, where the customer was new, and the sales from those customers. And we're looking to build out an email list. And the question we're asking ourselves is, we want to add this user to the email list. So we want to return yes if the customer status is new or they had sales greater than 3,000. So we can start by typing our if, go into our OR function. And so if our customer status is new, so does this equal our customer sales of new, and we'll lock that up. Or are the sales greater than 3,000? We'll lock that. And if one of those conditions is true, let's return yes to add them to our email list for promotions. And if both of those are false, we can say no. And we'll pull this formula down. And here we can see that this was a new customer with sales over 3,000. These were new customers. In cases where it's existing or customers with less than 3,000, those were ones that we did not add to this email list. And let's take a look at one more example with the if/or function and how we can use it to also do an additional calculation, keeping it simple for this example, but can get as complicated or complex as needed. So for this data set, we have order IDs, customer names, products. Then we go into order total, shipping, and whether the customer used a promo code or not. And what we want to pull over is if the order total is greater than $150 or a promo code was used, we want to remove the shipping cost. If that was false, we want to return the order total plus the shipping cost. So in this case, customers are getting a discount if they had an order over 150 or use a promo code. If not, want to make sure that the order total and the shipping costs are both included in the final price. So to get us started, let's do our if/or. And our logical test, logical number 1, will be our order total. And is that greater than 150? And for our second logical test, we can do is the promo code equal to yes. And then we can close around that. Right. If that is true, we want to make sure that we just return the order total, so we're not going to include the shipping charge. So if that is true, we can reference our order total here. And then if that is false, we want to return our order total plus our shipping costs. So we can add our order total plus shipping, D7, C7, close that, and pull this down. And in this case, we can see that these bolded examples show when we just kept our final price the same to our original order price. And these are the cases where our order total was below 150 and there's no promo code, so we did add the shipping cost into the final price. Now we took a look at how to use the if function with and, how to use the if function with or. Now let's take a look at how we can use the if function with both the and or function. So this is where we can look at several different criteria and whether they are met or not, and then return a value into the column. So looking at the similar data set to we had in our last example, but in this case, we're adding whether it was an expedited shipping or not. In that case, that will determine whether we include the shipping price. So the question we're going to be answering with this formula is if the order total is greater than $150 or a promo code was used, similar to our last example, but now adding and the order was not expedited, then we will remove the shipping cost. And if false, return order total plus shipping cost. So in this case, if it was expedited, we don't want to exclude shipping since that costs us extra. So there's a few ways that we can approach this. So let's start by typing if. Now let's go into our and function, and then into our or function. And so this will be a nested function. So right now we're at the or section. So we want to first look at our criteria that we want to see if either one of these are met, which is whether this was greater than $150 order or promo code was used. So similar to our last example. And so we can reference D7, whether that's greater than 150, and then whether promo code equals yes. Then we can close out of that. And we can see that that is included in our into our AND logic. So from here, we can go into our logical test for AND number 2. And this will be looking at the expedited column and whether this is yes or no. And so we can either do this equal to no or not equal to yes. So let's, in this case, do equals no. So the order is not expedited. Then if that is true, we will just return our order total. And if that is false, we'll return our order total plus our shipping cost. Let's close that out and let's see what our results are. Let's drag this formula down. All right. And as we're looking through these examples, so for example number 9, where we have an order total over $150, since this was expedited, we did include the shipping. Or in the case of row 14, where the order total was over $150 and there was a promo code used, but since it didn't meet the AND logic of not being expedited, we still included shipping into our final price. So that was a good walkthrough of the if function, looking at some basic single criteria, then going into multiple criteria, then how we can start stacking the if function with AND logic, with OR logic, and how we can use if and OR logic together to return what we're looking for.